Have you ever met someone who just refused to let go of something? I don't mean out of stubbornness. No. I mean that sweet kind of loyalty that turns into legend over time. I once knew a man who carried a camera for 60 years. 60. Through birthdays, breakups, bus rides, and every sunset you could name. He called it his eye. The rest of us called it that old lump of metal. He never noticed the world had changed, that phones had taken over, that selfies replaced soul, and maybe that's what made him beautiful. But what he didn't know, well, that's the part of the story that'll make you smile. So sit back, grab something warm to drink, and let me tell you about the man who carried photography for 60 years and finally let go. I once knew a man who carried a camera the way some people carry hope. Quietly, carefully, as if setting it down would make something inside him collapse. His name was Mr. Halden. He lived 2 doors down from me in an old brick building that creaked when the wind passed. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him simply as the man with the camera. It wasn't one of those sleek digital things you see now. It was a heavy, boxy camera, the kind with peeling leather and a faint smell of dust and film rolls long gone. He carried it everywhere, to the cafe, the park, even to the corner store. He'd sit at the cafe window every morning, a small cup of tea cooling beside him, his hand resting protectively over the camera as though it were a small animal that might try to run away. Funny thing is, he didn't take pictures anymore. The camera had stopped working years ago. The shutter was stuck halfway, the lens slightly fogged from age. Once, when I dared ask why he still carried it, he gave me a smile that seemed to remember 1,000 things at once. Because it remembers what I forget, he said. That answer stuck to me like the smell of old film chemicals. I'd see him walking down the street, muttering about light angles and exposure times to no one in particular, and I'd think about how the world had changed around him. People rushed past with phones in their hands, snapping photos that vanished into digital clouds before the day was over. Meanwhile, there was Mr. Halden, quietly faithful to a camera that hadn't blinked in decades. There was something gently comic about it, but not in a cruel way. He wasn't ridiculous. He was comforting, like an old song you still even though you've forgotten most of the words. The neighborhood loved him for that. He reminded us of slower days, when photographs were printed, framed, and cherished, when moments weren't just captured, they were kept. Sometimes I'd watch him from my window and imagine what that camera might hold if it still worked. Maybe a lifetime of laughter, love, and lost afternoons. But maybe in a way it still did. Maybe the real memory was never inside the camera at all. He'd grown older, of course, slower, shakier, but the camera stayed as constant as his shadow. Watching him made me wonder if, after a while, the things we hold on to start holding us instead. And every time I saw him, that gentle man with his worn-out camera, I couldn't help but feel that maybe we all carry something that's long stopped working, but we keep it close anyway. Because sometimes, letting go feels like forgetting who we are. One quiet Sunday morning, the neighborhood woke up to something unusual. Mr. Halden standing in the park, camera raised, squinting into the sunlight as if time itself had rolled backward. He hadn't taken a photo in years. Normally, he just carried the camera like an old friend tagging along. But that day, something had shifted. I was sitting on a bench with my coffee when I saw him pacing back and forth, searching for the right spot, like a general plotting a battle plan. He was talking softly to himself. No, too bright here, too much shadow there. And then finally he stopped under the big oak tree near the fountain. He lifted the camera slowly, hands trembling, face glowing with a strange mix of nervousness and joy. You could see him mouthing the rhythm of it. One click, one breath. For a moment, it was as if he was young again. The world held its breath with him. And then, click. Except, of course, nothing happened. No shudder, no whirring sound, no satisfying click. Just silence, followed by a tiny metallic cough in the old camera, like it was clearing his throat after a very long nap. He blinked at it, frowned, gave it a little shake, the universal sign of human denial, and tried again. Still nothing. Finally, he lowered it and sighed, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed. Really laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from deep inside when you finally stop pretending something still works. He looked up and noticed me watching. Instead of being embarrassed, he smiled and said, "I suppose she's finally tired." "She?" I asked. "Of course," he said, patting the camera gently. "You spend 60 years with someone, you learn their moods." I couldn't help but laugh too. The sight of this old man, standing in the middle of the park, talking to his camera as though we're an old lover, was both absurd and profoundly touching. Then he did something unexpected. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect, maybe farewell, and said quietly, "Thank you for remembering with me." It was such a small, tender thing, but in that moment, the entire park seemed to soften. A jogger slowed down. A mother stopped pushing her stroller. Even the pigeons looked politely away. When he finally walked home, he carried the camera differently, not clutching it to his chest, but holding it by its strap, swinging lightly at his side. It looked lighter somehow. I didn't realize it then, but that was the day something began to change in him. That day, the camera stopped being a shield and started becoming a story. After that Sunday in the park, Mr. Halden changed in little ways, small shifts that only those who truly watched could notice. He still carried the camera, of course, but there was something gentler about the way he held it now, like he'd stopped asking it to remember and started simply keeping it company. A few days later, I stopped by his flat to return a book he'd lent me months before, a photography collection so old it smelled like the attic of a forgotten museum. He invited me in, and for the first time, I saw his home. It was exactly what I imagined. Every inch of wall space was covered in photographs, not hung neatly in frames, but pinned, taped, and layered like overlapping memories. Some were faded, almost a ghost, others sharp and bright. Black and white faces smiled at me from the 1950s. Streets long demolished still stood proudly in sepia tones. It felt like stepping inside a camera itself, if cameras had hearts. In the corner sat an old developing table, long retired, covered with dust and a few coffee rings. And right there beside it was a small photograph in a cracked frame, the only one standing alone. It was turned slightly away, half hidden behind a stack of old film canisters. I don't know why I asked, but I did. "Who's that?" He followed my gaze, smiled faintly, and said, "That's the one I never took." I thought I'd misheard him. "But it's a picture." He chuckled softly. "Yes and no. The film jammed that day. I remember standing in front of her. Her name was Claire, and thinking, this one matters. But the shutter froze, and I never got the shot. I was furious at the time." He paused, then looked at the photograph again. Later, I realized maybe that was for the best. Some things are meant to be remembered, not recorded. He poured us both tea in chip cups and continued. "You see, photographs are wonderful, but they're greedy. They try to capture everything, light, color, memory. And sometimes, in trying to keep a moment, we lose how it felt to be there. Maybe that's why I never threw the camera away. It reminds me that memory doesn't have to be perfect to be precious." We sat in silence after that, sipping tea among a sea of frozen moments. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm went off, a dog barked, and the world kept spinning outside. And for the first time, I didn't see him as a man with a camera. I saw him as a keeper of stories, a man who understood that letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently. I think that was the day I started to understand what he was really carrying all those years. The neighborhood began to change the way old songs get remixed. Same melody, new beat. The corner cafe where Mr. Halden once sat with his tea and camera became a juice bar with neon lights and music that hummed through the sidewalk. The bookstore turned into a co-working space. Even the cobblestones seemed to shine differently, as if someone had polished away the dust of memory. But Mr. Halden stayed the same. Every morning, he'd shuffle down the street, nodding politely at strangers, his camera still hanging from his neck. Though now, it looked more like an antique than an instrument. Teenagers would point sometimes, whispering to each other, "Whoa, is that a real camera?" And he'd just smile and say, "It used to be." He never said that line as a complaint, more like a small joke between himself and time. There was something wonderfully comic about the way he coexisted with progress. Smartphones buzzing around him like flies. People snapping endless photos of their brunches, while he simply walked past with his silent, faithful companion. Once, I saw him at a crosswalk beside a young man holding the latest phone. The man tapped his screen, raised it, and took a selfie with the streetlight behind him. Mr. Halden, not to be outdone, lifted his camera too, lens foggy, body dented, strap frayed. The young man laughed. Mr. Halden laughed louder. Then he leaned in and said, "You see, son, mine doesn't even need Wi-Fi. She remembers me just fine." That was his way. Humor as a kind of grace. Still, I could sense something shifting beneath that laughter. His steps were slower. He forgot names now and then. He'd wander into the shop and ask for film that hadn't been made in 20 years, only to smile when the clerk looked confused. "That's all right," he'd say. "I was just testing if you're from my century." Despite everything, people adored him. He was like the soul of the street, a walking relic who made you feel oddly calm, like maybe the world wasn't racing ahead as fast as it seemed. One autumn afternoon, I found him sitting on a bench outside his building, the camera resting beside him instead of around his neck. He was watching kids take pictures of each other with their phones, laughing, posing, spinning in the leaves. His eyes were soft, not jealous, just quietly proud. When I sat beside him, he said, "You know, I used to think photography was about freezing moments, but now I think it's about letting them run free, trusting they'll come back to you when they matter." And I thought, maybe that's why he carried that camera all those years. Not because he couldn't let go, but because he wanted to remember how. Winter came quietly that year, the way goodbyes often do, soft, without ceremony. The mornings grew slower, the tea cooler, and Mr. Halden's steps lighter, like he was learning how to fade gracefully. One morning, he knocked on my door holding a small paper bag. Inside was the old camera, his companion of 60 years. "I think it's time," he said, smiling with that calm, mischievous twinkle that made you unsure whether he was serious or just setting up another one of his quiet jokes. "Time for what?" I asked. "For her to rest," he said, patting the camera affectionately. "She's been working overtime in my memories." We sat together at the cafe, the same one that now served turmeric lattes and playlists instead of peace. He placed the camera on the table, like it was a guest joining us. I half expected it to order something too. "Do you remember the park?" he asked. "Of course." "Well," he said, "I think I'm ready for that photograph now. The one I couldn't take before." I didn't understand at first, but then he handed me my phone, and laughed. "Let's see if your gadget can make an old man look interesting." So I took his picture. He posed simply. No forced smile, no dramatic gesture. Just him sitting with his tea, one hand resting gently on the camera, sunlight slipping across his face. It wasn't a grand portrait, but it was real, honest. When I showed him the photo, he studied it quietly for a while. Then he nodded. "Not bad," he said. She'd approve. He asked me to print it, which I did that evening. The next day, I found it pinned to his wall, right above the photograph of Claire, the one that never was. Beneath it, he'd written in shaky handwriting, "Finally took it." That weekend, I noticed the camera was gone from his neck. When I asked him where it was, he smiled and said, "Somewhere Light can find it." He never explained what that meant, but later I found out he'd donated it to a small photography museum downtown. Apparently, he'd told the curator, "This old thing stopped taking pictures long ago, but she's full of them if you listen closely." That was Mr. Halden, always half poet, half trickster. Even when saying goodbye, he made it sound like a punchline. And yet, beneath the laughter, there was peace. Because I think in that moment, he'd done what most of us spend our whole lives trying to do. He'd learned how to let go without losing what mattered. Spring arrived like an apology for winter. Gentle, slow, full of second chances. The trees along our street bloomed again, and sunlight began sneaking through the windows, painting gold on everything it touched. But there was one window that stayed closed that season, Mr. Halden's. For a few days, no one saw him at the cafe. The regulars noticed first. "Maybe he's just under the weather," someone said. Another added, "Or maybe he's finally traveling." It was meant as a joke, but it felt too tender to laugh at. Then, One morning, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me, my name written in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside was a single page and a photograph. The photo was the one I'd taken. Him sitting at the cafe, sunlight across his face, hand on his camera. But now, there was something written beneath it in pen. When you've held something long enough, the letting go becomes its own kind of keeping. There was no sadness in it, just a quiet completion. He'd gone peacefully in his sleep a few nights earlier, they told me. The nurses said he'd had the photo on his bedside table. They said he looked content, as if he'd finally taken the picture he'd been chasing all his life. After the small memorial, a few of us gathered at the park bench where he'd once stood, camera in hand. The city hummed around us, phones flashing, laughter spilling, pigeons pretending to be philosophers as usual. I brought my own camera that day, not my phone, but an old film one I found in a thrift shop. I thought he'd like that. I took a single picture of the bench. The light wasn't perfect, the focus a little off, but I smiled anyway, because I finally understood it didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be. Later that week, I passed by the photography museum. There was his camera, displayed in a glass case, a small plaque beside that read, "Donated by Mr. Halden, in service from 1963 to 2023, retired with dignity." I stood there for a long time, half laughing, half crying. It was the most human thing I'd ever seen, a farewell wrapped in humor and grace. That night, as I walked home, I looked at the world differently. Every streetlight, every passing face, every shadow on a wall, they all looked like photographs I didn't need to take. And for the first time, I felt what he must have felt all those years. That memory isn't something you hold with your hands. It's something that lives quietly behind your eyes. So now, when I see people rushing to capture every moment, I think of him, of that old camera that stopped blinking, and the man who taught me that sometimes the truest pictures are the ones we simply carry inside. And maybe that's enough. Funny thing, isn't it? He spent a lifetime trying to capture moments, and in the end, the moment captured him. When he finally set that old camera down, it wasn't sadness that filled the air. It was something lighter, like a sigh that had waited 60 years to breathe. Maybe that's what letting go really means. Not losing something, just making space for what's next. So if there's something you've been holding on to, a dream, a memory, a version of yourself, maybe today is a good day to say thank you and set it down gently. Because sometimes freedom doesn't come from chasing the picture. It comes from finally stepping out of frame. Thank you for listening. If this story warmed your heart, even a little, don't forget to subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a quiet smile today. Until next time, sleep well. Good night.